Welcome to another episode of InRange TV. Today we have another historical vignette, and this is a quite interesting one indeed. I have profiled topics like this from history for now over 8 years on the channel, and I always try to focus on ones that have been intentionally omitted from the common understanding and narrative. I refer to that as intentionally induced amnesia. And the reason for that is generally pretty obvious. These stories, whether the ones that I talk about from 1811 slave revolt to the Civil War, 1860 race riots in which refugee slaves defended themselves with weapons provided to them by abolitionists, to 2005 post-New Orleans Katrina, and others, all lend themselves to a understanding of American history and culture, both in firearms and otherwise, that the people in power really didn't want to be in the public narrative because it didn't help them in their particular goals and beliefs. Now, many of these topics I talk about, although as recent as 2005, were in the past. But in this instance, this story today is an instance in which we can see this happening in actual real time. Executive Order 14151 was signed by President Trump on January 20th, 2025, the DEI order. And while I was doing research for this particular video, I came to find that there was an archaeologist at the Bureau of Land Management, hereto I'm going to refer to in the video as BLM, who was doing research on the old cemetery of Fort Lincoln in regards to this topic we're talking about today. And there was an article on the BLM website narrating and talking about his research and adding more information to the story of Mrs. Nash, who we're profiling here in this video. However, that executive order signed on January 20th, just a few weeks later, this story was deleted from the Bureau of Land Management's website. We know many other stories like this are happening currently right now, but here is an instance in which we can see intentionally induced amnesia happening literally in real time because the bigoted goals of our current government elect do not want stories like this to be in the public narrative. And this story today, amongst others, hopefully I'll profile more of them, do not lend themselves to their current goals and intentions. Luckily, the Wayback Machine had archived the article from the archaeologist working for the BLM before it was deleted, and I have archived that as a PDF, uploaded it to the InRange Google Drive, and there's a link in the description below. The internet's forever, y'all. So good luck with that. At any rate, let's get on with the actual story itself. Most people are familiar with General Armstrong Custer. He was a fairly famous officer in the U.S. Civil War and a very famous general during the quote-unquote Indian Wars, mostly because the U.S. 7th Cavalry met its catastrophic end, for the most part, at the Battle of Little Bighorn, including General Custer himself. Most of the U.S. 7th Cavalry was destroyed in that battle, referred to as the Battle of Greasy Grass by the indigenous forces. However, before that happened, the U.S. 7th Cavalry was stationed in Kentucky, later to be stationed at Fort Lincoln in the Dakota Territory. And this is where we find Mrs. Nash joining them in Kentucky. Mrs. Nash, according to all the records we can acquire, was helping run cattle on the Santa Fe Trail. But her employer at the time said that based on the way you're presenting gender-wise, you would be better off seeking something more suitable towards your gender. And Mrs. Nash landed up acquiring employment by the U.S. 7th Cavalry as a laundress and midwife. This is not uncommon. The U.S. 7th Cavalry, amongst other Western Indian War cavalry and other divisions, had a lot of civilians traveling with them, merchants, tradesmen, and laundresses, midwives, and some of the families of the soldiers themselves. Remember, this is the frontier. Travel is difficult, so you bring your family with you. But having merchants and other people traveling with you, blacksmiths, butchers, etc., made these divisions self-sufficient. So Mrs. Nash, who, by the way, is her second married name, we're not sure about her actual name pre-marriage. It might be in that article that I have linked in the PDF, figured out by the archaeologist from the BLM, but we're not certain. But we're going to refer to her as Mrs. Nash, was absolutely beloved by the U.S. 7th Cavalry. She was literally friends with everyone. We have a quote here from Catherine Gibson, a wife of a Fort Lincoln soldier, documented Nash's vital work delivering babies. Mrs. Nash was a very capable midwife. She handled those babies not only with efficiency, but with marked tenderness as well. It's reported that Mrs. Nash was such a successful and effective midwife that she was present for pretty much every birth at the fort amongst the U.S. 7th Cavalry, and everyone appreciated and adored her work. She was well liked. Not only that, she was actually direct friends with General Armstrong Custer himself and his wife Elizabeth, who went by the nickname Libby. Mrs. Custer, Libby, said it about Mrs. Nash, "I considered her a treasure." However, they did note, she does note in her journal, some unique features about Mrs. Nash. She had so coarse and stubborn a beard that her chin had a blue look after shaving, in a marked contrast to her swarthy face. She was tall, angular, awkward, and seemingly coarse, but I knew her to be tender-hearted. She always came at night, and when I went out to pay her, she was very shy and kept a veil pinned about her lower face. Now, one of the things Mrs. Nash said about her history before joining the 7th Cavalry is she told people that she was from Mexico, and she was financially well off before ever joining as a laundress and midwife for the U.S. 7th Cavalry. And in fact, she was so well liked that she was married not once, not twice, but 3 times amongst soldiers amongst the U.S. 7th Cavalry. Her first marriage was to a man named Clifton, who later deserted her and the base with a substantial amount of her financial resources. She was married a second time to Mr. Nash, another soldier at the U.S. 7th Cavalry, and he did the same thing, abandoned her and his post with a substantial amount of her money. But she ultimately got married a third time to John Noonan. John Noonan joined the U.S. 7th Cavalry in 1876 as a private and was a sergeant by 1878, so he was well appreciated as a very effective soldier and was actually a direct helper and assistant to General Armstrong Custer himself. In fact, here's a picture of John Noonan standing behind General Armstrong Custer on one of their bear hunts. Noonan was a essential helper to Custer himself. Now, amongst this, as a laundress, besides being a midwife, Mrs. Nash was well respected, and every time you see General Custer looking very dashing in his clothing, which he was well known to do, he took a lot of effort in his personal appearance and how he presented to the public. His clothes were well laundered, well pressed, and maintained, most likely directly by Mrs. Nash. Now, we refer to her because of her second marriage as Mrs. Nash. I don't know why we don't call her Mrs. Noonan, but we do call her Mrs. Nash. That's just how history works sometimes. However, there were other, of course, patrols, for lack of a better term, that were done by the U.S. 7th Cavalry into Indian Territory. And John Noonan was on one of these patrols when Mrs. Nash became very ill. And before he came back and before he found out, she died from what appeared to be appendicitis on October 30th, 1878. And when the fort physicians were doing their research work onto why she passed away, I guess now we would call it an autopsy, they were astonished to find that she had what they called male genitalia. And this, of course, was shocking. She was married to not one, not two, but 3 U.S. 7th Cavalry soldiers. And by all accounts, her third marriage to John Noonan was a very loving and caring one. And they were considered one of the prize couples of Fort Lincoln. Well, this surprise discovery by the physicians post-death became public knowledge quickly. This went about as a rumor amongst the fort. It landed up in the Bismarck News, and it landed up amongst other newspapers about this wife of Mrs. Nash, direct friend of General Custer and Elizabeth Custer, was, quote, a man. Now, what we don't know about Mrs. Nash is what she really thought of herself. She clearly presented as a woman and wanted to be treated as a woman. She was probably by modern standards transgender, but we don't know that specifically. Could have been intersex. It could have been the doctors didn't understand intersexuality and couldn't identify the body based on what they knew at the time. That is certainly possible. But what we do know is she was a woman in the U.S. 7th Cavalry that was a loved laundress, midwife, and married to 3 separate soldiers, as well as a friend of the Custers themselves. When Sergeant Noonan came back to camp, he came to find out that his wife had passed. He immediately turned sullen, of course. This person that he loved in his life had died, but he was acting strangely. On top of that, the local, of course, these other soldiers, now knowing about what the physician said, were doing exactly what you would expect. They were not being kind to him about his wife passing, but were being quite cruel and mean. They were ribbing him. This was a point of public spectacle. It was in the news. And John Noonan, Sergeant Noonan, insisted that Mrs. Nash, his wife, was a woman, and that in fact they were working to conceive their own child. So he could not comprehend what was going on with this narrative from the physicians. Again, we don't understand exactly what's going on here, transgender, intersex, but something was. However, this ultimately, 1 month later, literally 1 month to the day, the amount of persecution that was being put up against Sergeant Noonan post his wife's death turned out to be too much. Berkman was a carpenter and saw Noonan on his last day. Noonan walked into the room. His face was gaunt and sort of set. The carpenter looked up. "Hello, Noonan," he says. "Say, you and the Mrs. Noonan never had no children, did you?" And we all started laughing at him. But all of a sudden, Noonan stood looking at us like an animal that had been hurt. We did not have the sense to stop him. At this point in the video, I discussed the historically accurate version of how Sergeant Noonan unalived himself, as they say now on YouTube. But after publishing the video, haters immediately started flagging it, and YouTube set this video to 18 plus, which means almost no one will see it. So I am re-uploading it with this now edited out. Sadly, the soldiers and Berkman himself did feel pretty badly about ribbing him the way they did. And here's a quote from Berkman. "It takes all kinds of men to make up an army. Officers, of course, whose doings is writ up in books. But it takes a lot of common fellers, too, like me and Noonan. Men that don't know nothing except when they do what they're told, that's kill and get killed, and that the world never hears about. And yet to ourselves we seemed important. Noonan's troubles meant just as much to him as though he'd been a major. Hundreds of graves scattered over Dakota and Montana of men that's never been missed, never been writ up, but they was good soldiers just the same, and without 'em there wouldn't been no country." So, the gravity of how they treated this man post the death of someone he loved sunk in only after he committed as a result of their actions. Noonan himself was ultimately buried in the cemetery but reinterred along with Custer. However, Mrs. Nash was buried in the Fort Cemetery with little fanfare and really little notation. And that's why we see this archaeologist from the Bureau of Land Management doing research that's now been deleted by the government off of a government website regarding actual history about an important woman, not only to General Custer himself, to General Custer's wife, to the U.S. 7th Cavalry as a laundress and midwife, but also to Sergeant Noonan, who loved her as the wife she was to him. That is an outrage and a disgrace, and it's a very real example of one amongst many current situations we see right now of intentionally induced historical amnesia. I would like to say that that sort of thing was done in the modern day, but it's really on the rise, and we're seeing it happening right now every day currently in the situation here in the United States. And it's up to us to preserve this history and the memory of these people, the men, these women, their husbands, and the things they went through, because the stories that they represent on the frontier then show us that that these people are part of our society and always have been. They were loved, respected, and treated as part of the family until they found out that they somehow didn't fit in to what their perceived notions were of who they should have been or what they expected them to be. And suddenly, they're reviled. This is a difficult topic to talk about. I may have fumbled my words here and there, and I apologize for that. I had to use notes here because I wanted to get things right, but I also wanted to let you know about this important story May we not forget Sergeant Noonan and Mrs. Nash and their contributions to American culture and the lives that they lived together, that they loved each other and persevered in a time and space where they weren't accepted. And now, in 2025, we see that happening to them once again. Let's cure that narrative. If you'd like, please share this video, download the archived PDF that I've uploaded to my drive, and let's make sure more people hear about this than ever have. If you like, I don't know if words like, if you appreciate this content, please subscribe, share this with your friends. It's important to me that we get these narratives out to a broader public because it helps us understand the world we really live in and helps us understand more the people around us. If you really like this kind of content and want to help support us continuing doing this sort of work, we are intentionally demonetized on YouTube. I have demonetized my channel. We make no revenue from views on this channel. We are supported by viewers like you via direct support via patreon.com/InRange TV. And I'm thankful for all of you that have helped us do this now for a decade. If you'd like to, patreon.com/InRange TV. Every dollar counts. But more importantly, share this video so that we can remember Sergeant Noonan and his wife, Mrs. Nash, so that they may not be forgotten in a world that's trying to erase them from our history. Thanks for watching.